And I stand in awe of you. Yes, I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due. I stand in awe of you. Yes, I stand in awe of you. Oh, I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due. I stand in awe of you. The splendor of a king, clothed in majesty. Let all the earth rejoice, all the earth rejoice. He wraps himself in light, and darkness
everybody. Welcome to Sunday morning. So we'll start with an announcement about the building. So we are up to $531,242, which is an increase of $6,000. So that's exciting. I think that was the only announcement. So I'll just get started here with some prayer. All right, Lord, I thank you for the chance to do this, and I just pray that you would help me to be wise in what I say and how I say it. I pray that this stuff would be applicable and help people in their lives. And as far as the building, Lord, I pray that you would use that as a great blessing to our community and that you would do great things with that. And I thank you for everyone who's contributed, and I pray that you would just give people wisdom as far as how to contribute in the future. So, in Jesus' name, amen. All right. So, I am a music teacher. That is my profession. And so, as a teacher, I'm always impressed by great teachers. And so that's one thing about Jesus that I think is very impressive, is how good he was at teaching. And I feel like that maybe isn't recognized enough, is Jesus was a fabulous teacher. And the Gospels place great emphasis on Jesus, both his teaching and his actions, which are also actually a form of teaching. So Jesus gets called teacher a lot by people when they come up to him and ask him things and stuff. And it's interesting that he never corrects them. He never goes, yeah, actually, I'm the Messiah, so a teacher, you're not really. That's not really what he does. He accepts being called teacher, but he goes beyond that. Jesus in John 13:13 refers to himself as a teacher. So this is at the Last Supper. He just finished washing the disciples' feet, and he says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightfully so, for that is what I am." So he says, you are right to call me teacher and right to call me Lord. That's pretty straightforward, and I find that pairing of teacher and Lord interesting, and that's going to kind of come up throughout my sermon here. But the whole point of him saying that was that he wanted the disciples to follow his example. He said, I'm your teacher and Lord, and I washed your feet, so you should wash each other's feet, which is kind of important, that Jesus wants us to follow his example. And that ties into one more verse. This one's from Matthew, chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, very famous, well-known verse. And Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." So it's interesting there. Jesus ties finding rest for your soul into learning from him, right? So if you're weary and burdened and your soul isn't doing very well, it might be that the answer is to learn from Jesus. So I've found a lot of people, myself included, are weary and burdened. I think that's why we're watching so much Hulu and drinking so much coffee all the time. We just need a break. But I think the answer might not be coffee or Hulu. It might be learning from Jesus. So that's kind of the goal of this lesson, is to find an example of Jesus' teaching and learn from it and see if we can find some rest for our souls. I find also in this verse, it's important that he calls himself gentle and humble in heart, because where we're about to go, Jesus is not going to seem gentle or humble at all. And so I think that can only be understood in the context of him as a teacher. So it's all going to hopefully tie together. So we're going to go forward 4 chapters in Matthew to chapter 15, and starting in verse 21. And there we find this story. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." So I'm going to stop there for right now. That is horrible. And it is important that we don't try to get away from how horrible that is, because I think it's important. Let's look at what happened there. So Jesus went to this woman's hometown. She didn't come to him. He went to her area. And when she came to him asking for help, he ignored her. Isn't that kind of what we all desperately fear will happen when we cry out to God for help, that he'll just ignore us? And so not only that, but she kept after it, because this is her daughter. What parent wouldn't do whatever they had to do to try to help their child? And so in her desperation, she keeps crying out. And so then Jesus makes excuses. I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel. Sorry, I can't help you. And so she still won't give up. And so then he calls her, and by extension her daughter, dogs. He says, it's not right for me to help you and your daughter, you dogs, when I was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. So that is truly terrible. And especially because the only reason it seems like that he won't help her when he's helped so many Jewish people is that she's not Jewish. So it's racially motivated, the reason that Jesus is so cruel and dismissive and terrible to this woman. So this doesn't seem like the Jesus we know at all. It's kind of horrifying, honestly. And honestly, for most of my life, I hated this story because I couldn't make any categories for it. I couldn't understand what was going on. So, fortunately, I think it can be understood, and it helps if we look at the disciples and what they did. So when this woman first shows up and Jesus ignores her, what do the disciples do? They're not freaked out at all, actually. They're not horrified and go, Jesus, what are you doing? Like we do. They go, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. They're encouraged by him ignoring this woman. So I think that therein lies what's really going on here. So what Jesus was doing was actually the standard way Jews interacted with Gentiles, which was as little as possible. The Jews in the first century had no love for the Gentiles and wanted nothing to do with them. They found the Gentiles' ways and their practices disgusting and terrible, and they wanted to stay away from the Gentiles as much as possible. It was to the point where if Jewish people interacted with Gentiles too much, then other Jews could consider them ceremonially unclean, and they couldn't go to the temple or interact in the synagogue. So the Jews didn't want to be around the Gentiles. Also, there was some resentment there, because the Jews are God's people, right? They're supposed to be under God's blessing and have all this stuff, and instead, they were mostly poor and oppressed, and the Gentiles were in charge and had all the power and all the say-so, and all the control and all the money, and so the Jews had some serious resentment going toward the Gentiles on account of that. And the areas of Tyre and Sidon were particularly wealthy, so it would have been extra annoying to the Jews, the Gentiles and their prosperity there in Tyre and Sidon. So you can see where that could happen. But the thing is, these ideas didn't develop independent of Scripture. There is plenty of scriptural support for those kinds of ideas and those kinds of feelings toward the Gentiles from the Jewish perspective. So, for example, Tyre and Sidon, right? So Ezekiel 28 talks about Tyre and Sidon. It's kind of a long chapter, so I won't read the whole thing about Tyre, but to summarize, Tyre's king had great wealth due to his intelligence, and this made him proud. So he was a wise businessman, but he started thinking he was extremely great and extremely smart and got really puffed up about it. So God got offended and said to Ezekiel that he will bring a terrible nation to destroy Tyre, and that then the king would realize who was really in charge. And then that is followed by a big long lament that has lots of cosmic language. It's very interesting. You should probably read it sometime. So, right after that, Sidon gets denounced. So Tyre and Sidon were very close together. They were side-by-side cities. And so Tyre gets denounced, and then Sidon gets denounced. The denunciation of Sidon is a little shorter, so I'll read you that in its entirety. The word of the Lord came to me, this being Ezekiel, Son of man, set your face against Sidon, prophesy against her, and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Sidon, and among you I will display my glory. You will know that I am the Lord when I inflict punishment on you, and within you am proved to be holy. I will send a plague upon you, and make blood flow in your streets. The slain will fall within you, and the sword against you on every side. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So that's what God, in the time of Ezekiel, had to say to Sidon. It's not too hard to see where Jesus could be harsh with a woman from that area when you consider that kind of prophecy. So it goes further, though, because Mark doesn't call this woman a Canaanite. He calls her a Syrophoenician, but Matthew calls her a Canaanite, and I think he's trying to make a point there. Because that word Canaanite is pretty loaded, and anybody who's read in the Old Testament knows pretty much exactly where the Canaanites stand. Canaan is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 9 when his grandfather Noah curses him to be the lowest of slaves to his other relatives. And then they get mentioned here and there about how their land is going to be taken away from them and given to the Israelites. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, Moses is starting to give them instructions on how to do that. The first couple verses go like this. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Show them no mercy. Well, that's pretty straightforward. Book of Joshua outlines what happened during the conquest of Canaan, and they get instructions including leave nothing alive that breathes. So there's plenty of scriptural support, really, for not being kind to people from Tyre and Sidon. Canaanites especially. So, to summarize, first century Jews despised the Gentiles, stayed away from them whenever they possibly could, and had scriptural backing for those beliefs. So really, when you think about that, that's exactly what Jesus is doing. And I think he's doing it on purpose. He's acting like a good first century rabbi in relation to this woman at this point in the story. So really, from the first century Jewish perspective, it's not the beginning of the story that's shocking. That's the part that shocks us 2,000 years later, but at the time it made perfect sense. It's actually the end of the story that would be shocking to those guys. So what happens at the end of the story? So we'll finally go back and read the last few verses. So we'll start in verse 26, back in Matthew 15. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment. So you realize how monumental that is, what just happened in that story? Yeah, because see, the thing is, Jesus was what they call in the rap game a lyrical assassin. You could not argue with Jesus. Many people tried, right? Pharisees, Sadducees, teachers of the law, they all brought their arguments and their ideas, and Jesus laid them out, right? Anybody who tried to argue with Jesus left strongly corrected. And it got to the point where people were afraid to even ask him questions anymore because they just were sure to be laid down flat by his arguments. He was impossible to beat, except by this random Gentile woman. So she is the only person in all of Scripture who actually out-argued Jesus. How in the world did that happen? Well, see, we mentioned Jesus being gentle and humble, and I think here's where we see it. So Jesus wasn't trying to beat this woman. Not at the end of the story. He could have quoted lots of Scripture. He knew the Scripture a million times better than I do, and I found those verses pretty easily that back up treating this woman terribly. He could have quoted Scripture left and right and laid her flat, just like he laid the Pharisees flat. But he didn't. Not only that, her argument doesn't even include Scripture. Interestingly, I found this out in the study Bible. So the Jews didn't keep dogs as pets. They saw them as just wild scavengers that roamed around. Whereas Gentiles sometimes did keep dogs as pets, like we do. And so this woman's argument isn't based on Scripture, it's based on cultural differences. But Jesus accepted her argument. After he laid out the Pharisees left and right in previous stories and future stories, this woman, he listens to her and says she's right. Not only is she right, he commends her great faith and grants her request. So, I don't think Jesus was trying to win. I think he was happy to be beaten. It's kind of like when you're playing against your kid in chess and your kid beats you, and you're like, I could have beat him, but it's so much better to be beaten because it brings about better results than just winning all the time, right? So Jesus accepts her answer, commends her faith, and heals her daughter. You say, I'm not even going to know what that is. Because this is a Gentile woman. But who did Jesus do miracles for? The people of God. God's always doing miracles for the people of God for two reasons. It proves he's the covenant God, that they can trust him, and he cares about them and wants to help their situation. But it's always in terms of the covenant people, the Jews. And this woman has a miracle done for her. Not only that, who was supposed to have great faith in Yahweh? It was the Jews. They were the ones who were supposed to have the greatest faith in Yahweh and have that influence their actions. But it was this woman who gets commended for her great faith. So really what Jesus just did was induct this random Gentile woman into the kingdom of God, into the people of God. And that is monumental. So, you can just imagine the disciples now. Just, oh, we thought we had this figured out, and now, right? So it kind of raises the question real quick, why was Jesus so mean to begin with? And that's, I think, where it comes back to him being a teacher. Because I think he had to show us what was wrong before he could show us what was right. I think he had to play that role of rabbi and kind of lure his disciples into thinking that he was going to act like they were expecting him to act, and then he could totally reverse it. And it just gives it a lot more power and a lot more punch. So I think the first part of the story was meant to show us what not to do. So when we read Jesus ignoring this woman, making excuses, calling this woman and her daughter dogs, we say, no, Jesus, don't act like that, please. You can't do that. And really what I think it is Jesus holding up a mirror and saying, no, my people, don't do that. Don't call people dogs. Don't ignore them. Don't make excuses. So that's why we need to embrace the horror, so we can see when we act like that. That's what it really looks like, right? It's a terrible look on Jesus, and it's also a terrible look on us. So the second part of the story provides the counter-narrative. Counter-narrative, I think, is underappreciated. So that's where if you've got a problem with something, you have to have a better idea, right? So it's super easy to complain about things, but you got to have something else to say, or else all you're doing is complaining and it's not making anything any better, right? I mentioned I'm a teacher. That I find happens a lot with teenagers, that they have a lot of complaints but not a lot of counter-narrative. And when they do have counter-narrative, I tend to listen to them a lot more. This is stupid. I've kind of lost any response to that. But if they give me something to work with, then I listen to them, right? So Jesus has given us something to work with, and that's good. Because humanity, for the most part, has spent all of our history doing the same thing and failing to come up with a better idea. We're all just looking around at each other. Well, do you have a better idea? No. Do you have a better idea? No. Well, I guess we'll just keep doing the same thing. That doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work, but we can't come up with something any better. See, that's where Jesus is awesome, because he breaks in from outside the system and gives us a better idea. And I think that's what he's doing here. So, we can't figure this stuff out on our own. That's part of why we need Jesus to teach it to us. So, all right, what I would like for us to take away from this. Firstly, Jesus is better at interpreting Scripture than we are, right? If anyone was going to be good at interpreting the Scriptures, it'd be the Pharisees. Those guys put as much stock in Scripture as we do, if not more. They knew it much better than us. It was common practice for Pharisees to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible. Can you imagine that? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Can you imagine trying to memorize Numbers? But they did it frequently. And they didn't just memorize. They didn't just know it. They argued about it and discussed it and tried to figure out and work out what the best way to apply it was. They were doing the work. And they were so wrong so much of the time. That's why Jesus had to correct them all the time. They had their worked out, logical arguments that they thought were what God wanted, and Jesus came in and said, no, you're wrong. You're not interpreting it at all. You don't know the law and the prophets. So that should be a lesson to us, because it's easy to get kind of uppity when you start to know some things about Scripture. But I think we need to remember to approach it with humility. Right? Just because we know that one verse, or we heard that one awesome teaching about it, doesn't mean that we know everything we need to know. And it doesn't even mean we're right. If you think about it, well-meaning, intelligent people, it's possible for 2 well-meaning, intelligent people to look at the exact same passage of Scripture and find different interpretations for it. And that's important to remember, because it's very easy for us to think, well, if somebody disagrees with me, they must either be evil or stupid. Or probably both, really, because an intelligent, good person would come to the same conclusions as me, because I'm an intelligent, good person. So if you don't agree with me, you must not be intelligent or good or either, right? But see, that is a dangerous way to go about interpreting things. It's better to do it with humility and say, well, maybe we don't see eye to eye, and maybe I'm wrong. That is a possibility we have to accept sometimes. On the other hand, though, we can't just have a free-for-all where people decide what they would believe anyway and then find some place in Scripture that agrees with them. So that then, oh yeah, you know that thing that I believed before I ever really thought about Jesus, and that I would believe whether or not I believed in Jesus? Turns out Jesus agrees with me, right? We don't want to get into that area either. That's a bad spot to be. So what's the counter narrative? I was talking of counter narrative. Neither of those options is really good. So I think the counter narrative is this. If your interpretation smells like Jesus, then it's probably got something to it. So if you're reading something and you come to a conclusion and it smells like Jesus, you're probably okay to go ahead with that. If it doesn't smell like Jesus, it's probably wrong and it's probably dangerous. So you need to rethink it. Get some outside help on that one. And so the thing is, our noses are going to need some calibration to figure out what Jesus smells like. Right? We don't just know, and we know this from the Gospels. People misunderstood Jesus constantly. They constantly thought they had him figured out and were constantly wrong. And it doesn't stop in the Gospels. It's not like you get to the book of Acts and all of a sudden the disciples have it all figured out. They messed it all up in Acts too. So Paul goes around and he does his best, but he messes it up. His churches mess it up. That's why he wrote the letters, is to try and correct their course a little bit. So people make mistakes, but you should take heart with that. First off, accept that you're going to make mistakes, and don't give up when you do make mistakes, because really the whole biblical narrative is God's got a plan, and he insists on having people help him with that plan, and people mess it up, and then God makes it work anyway. Like, that is what happens over and over and over in the big arcs of Scripture. That's what happens. So we can rest in the knowledge that our mistakes won't be big enough to derail God's plan ultimately. So it's okay to make mistakes. However, we will get better at what we practice. Music teacher, right? I believe in practice. And I have found to be true over and over. People get good at what they practice. And everybody's practicing something. So the key is to practice the right stuff. So, sorry, I lost my spot. Oh, yeah, it helps to know what Jesus said and did, right? If we're going to get to know what he smells like, then it's going to help us a lot if we know what he did, know what he said. Where do you find that? Well, the Gospels. That's why those guys wrote the Gospels, was that they wanted people who weren't there to witness Jesus' actions to be able to know what he said and what he did, how he acted, what his character was like. There's also church tradition. And church tradition, I mean, it goes back 2,000 years. There have been people trying to figure Jesus out to varying degrees of success, right? And some people got it totally wrong, and other people got some pretty good ideas, and both are helpful because it helps sometimes to know what not to believe, right? If you look at something and you're like, oh my gosh, this person doesn't understand Jesus at all, when you start to see yourself doing or thinking those kind of things, you can recognize them and say, oh, I'm thinking just like that guy. I don't want to think like that guy. I think I need to change course. Or you can read something that really just feeds your soul and you say, yes, that's what I need, right? Both are good. So look into what people have come up with throughout church tradition, far away in the past and then close near today. Both good. Also, pray. You've got to remember that spirit inside of you is the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. You got the Trinity on your side. They want you to succeed. God is pulling for you. He's saying, yes, come on, you can do it. And he wants you to succeed. So pray, ask him to help you, and he will do so. And lastly, discussion is really good and really important. I think the most dangerous ideas tend to come when you sit by yourself and think too much. Sitting alone and thinking too much leads to some weird, crazy, dangerous stuff. Whereas if you've got other people that you're talking to, yeah, it may involve them disagreeing with you, but it'll help keep you from going off the cliff, right? You'll have people saying, oh, no, you can't. That's not what that verse meant. Here, look at the context or whatever, and it'll at least make you rethink your idea, make you defend it a little bit, and sometimes you'll be like, oh yeah, I would have said I was wrong, that would have been terrible. So, discuss, talk to people about it. So, my goal with this message was to kind of get this ball rolling, of listening to Jesus and applying what he says and finding rest for our souls, right? So what's that going to look like with the passage we were talking about today? Okay, I think a couple of things. First up, the beginning of the story, when Jesus is playing the role, he ignores this woman, right? But then at the end of the story, when he's being himself, he engages with her. So I think that's what we need to do. The next time you get a chance to ignore somebody, especially somebody you don't like, or a person you shouldn't like, rather than doing the ignoring, engage. right? Listen to them when they talk, right? Don't just talk to them. Listen to what they have to say. Try to understand them. Try to learn from them and learn about them. Figure out where their perspective comes from and what it is they want and what they feel is important, right? Learn from people. And yeah, you could argue that this is hard in the time of coronavirus because you can't just go to big group gatherings of people and stuff. But really, I mean, we got the internet. If you want to find somebody who disagrees with you, it doesn't take more than a few key clicks, right? And you can be somewhere where somebody's disagreeing with you, and instead of ignoring them or talking bad about them behind their back, you can try to engage with them a little bit. The next time you get a chance to make excuses not to help, instead make a difference, right? The church should not be the group of people with the best excuses not to help people. That is not what we're called to do. There are people everywhere who need help, and again, with the coronavirus, there were people who were fine before who are not fine now, people who were already in trouble, who everything's worse now, right? And all those problems from before coronavirus mostly still exist. So there are a lot of people in need of help right now, and we should be the people who are helping them. So don't make excuses, make a difference. So the promise is that if we learn from Jesus, then we'll find rest for our souls. So I believe that because Jesus said it, and I trust Jesus. But I do have an idea of what that would look like how that would come about, where the rest would come from. See, the culture we live in is kind of steeped in outrage and offense. Everybody's offended all the time at those people and their horrible ideas that are ruining everything, and they're dangerous, and they're going to destroy the world, they're going to destroy the economy, they're going to destroy this or that. They're pulling everything we believe in down, right? So we have a lot of that going on. And the thing is, all of that offense, all of that judgment, all of that cataloging of all of another person's failures and all the ways that they haven't measured up or done what they were supposed to do, all of that takes energy. And you never get that energy back. It's always just spent on despising those people and holding those grudges. And so after a while, our poor souls, they're like a bodybuilder who only works one muscle group every single day, and instead of making their muscles stronger, it makes them weaker, breaks them down. I think that's maybe what's happened to America's soul, is we just are worn out from fighting. And so if instead we take that energy and use it to try to understand other people, try to connect with them, and try to make relationships with them, even if we don't like them or understand them or get along with them, if we use that energy to try to make peace instead of constantly waging war, then I think at the end of the day, we'll find our souls' energy has been better spent, and we get some of it back. We're not so tired all the time. We're not so weary. So I suspect that's what it'll look like. But the only way to find out is to try it. So that's what I would encourage you to do today, is to just find opportunities to engage with people, to help people, and to see what happens to your soul. Trust Jesus, follow his instruction. All right, let's pray real quick. Lord, I thank you again for the opportunity to preach. I do enjoy it, and I thank you that I get to do it. And I just pray that this would be a blessing and a help and an encouragement to people, that you would use your message and your word and Jesus' actions and his character to just bring us to a place where we want to be better people and where we actually know how, Lord. And I just pray that we can follow your example and follow you into trying to make the world better. In Jesus' name.